Broadcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Master Mentors, 30 transformative insights from our greatest minds. I had the opportunity to read this book, and we talked about a number of different themes in it, from how to listen, how to build better self-awareness, and how to deal with anxiety. But before we get into that, a little background in terms of who Scott Jeffrey Miller is. He actually currently serves as Franklin Covey's senior advisor on thought leadership, as well leading the strategy and development of the firm's speaker bureau. On top of that, he hosts On Leadership, which is a podcast. It's the world's largest and fastest growing leadership podcast. It reaches more than 6 million people weekly. And on top of that, he also authors a leadership column for Inc.com, and he's a best-selling author himself of the series Mess to Success. This was one of my favorite interviews, so let's get into it. Scott, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate this. You run a wildly successful podcast on leadership, but you also have a series of books that have been extremely successful. And for this, I wanted to talk about the second volume of Master Mentors. And I wanted to start this off with an observation that I had as I was reading it. Is, to me, it really helps eliminate the term self-made from what I would call the personal success vocabulary.
When you say the term self-made, Patrick, by the way, thank you for the platform and the spotlight today. That doesn't even compute in my formula of success. I mean, I've heard of the term. I know people probably think that to be true, but I could name for you right now extemporaneously with no preparation the 15, 20 people that were the key contributors to my success, starting with Jane and then Deborah and then Larry, moving on to Charles and Don and Chuck and Charles again, and Colleen and Todd and David and Stefan. And I can name the names of the people that were instrumental, transformative people in my life. People that lived next door to me and gave me their farmer's market stand to run while they went off to college, or early bosses, or Frank, one of my PR professors at Rollins College that launched my career. It doesn't even compute to me, this concept of self-made.
And I'm the same way. And I think we do such a disservice when we title people as self-made, because to me, I look at it and say, unless you have birthed yourself, made your own clothes, built your own house, everything, you need other people. And that's what I really loved about this book, is that on two fronts. One, you talk about your own story, the Bruce Williams show, which I'd love to talk about that, because to me, that's part of your narrative, I think, of going against not being self-made. He was a mentor for you. And then the title of the book itself, Master Mentors, also is suggestive of, we don't do this alone. We need other people around us. We can't be self-made, but I think we're self-motivated to be successful.
Yeah, beautifully said. The book is Master Mentors. There's 10 books in this 10-year volume series, one a year, every year, where I, like you, have the privilege of interviewing people of accomplishment on the podcast that I host, On Leadership with Scott Miller. And every year I write a book about it. And kind of chicken soup for the soul, right? It's not Jim Collins or Adam Grant kind of stuff. It's light, easy, breezy books where I highlight 30 people. And I think in many ways, Patrick, I'm redefining, along with other people's support like yours, what we think of as a mentor. I think a lot of us think a mentor is someone we're matched with in our organization. They're on the 7th floor, we're on the 1st floor, whatever it is. And we meet with them for 1 hour every month for 6 months and it's over. And yes, that works. And yes, that is valuable. And by the way, take advantage of that in your organization if they have a mentoring program. But I'm guessing, like you, most of the biggest mentors in my life, I never met. They didn't even know I exist, whether they're books that I read or conferences that I go to or podcasts that I listen to. And this man named Bruce Williams was a very famous, maybe not so famous, but he was a radio host in the 80s and 90s. He hosted an evening radio talk show back when there wasn't talk radio. In fact, his program was called TalkNet, and it turned into the Bruce Williams Show. And he was a small town mayor, entrepreneur, businessman, made lots of mistakes in life. And he held a 3-hour open line program where you could call in and talk about, I just inherited some money. What do I do? I want to buy a house. Do I need an attorney? What is life insurance, term versus whole life? He was kind of cantankerous, a little bit of a curmudgeon, but a genius. And for a decade, when most of the cool kids were listening to NXS and YouTube in the evening, not YouTube, U2, by the way, I was listening to Bruce Williams, and it had a massive transformation on my business acumen and my literacy, my desire to learn more. And he was the biggest mentor of my life. And Bruce Williams died, never knowing I even existed.
Now, as I read that, I loved that story in the book. I said before we started this recording is that I was listening to AC/DC at that point. I was not watching or listening to the Bruce Williams show, which I probably wish I should have been, but I wasn't. But it really is such a great story and lead into really what this book is about. I don't know if you're familiar with work by Napoleon Hill.
Sure, of course.
So do you remember Napoleon Hill talking about his trusted circle? That we're all imaginary people and it would be Abraham Lincoln or somebody else. And I think very much the same thing of these books is it provides an opportunity to think, what were they doing? Or how would they approach this? It's that same approach.
Patrick, to your point, I don't know about your entire career journey, but mine's been very blessed. I've worked super hard and earned a lot of my success through the guidance and the coaching of other people. But what I've also come to realize the first half of my career, I'm 54, the first half of my life or career, I very much intentionally had the spotlight focused on me, like literally turned the spotlight onto me. And now I think as I mature, and like you, the father of 3 young kids, yours a bit older than mine, I'm trying to discover my strengths and my talents are, I think I'm an aggregator. I think I'm a pollinator. I'm not sure I've ever had an original idea in my entire life. Most of us haven't. And once you move past that horrifying fact that most of us haven't had an original thought in our life, I think the contribution I'm making now through this book series and a podcast like yours is allowing people access. I didn't know about this person or that person. What is this book you referenced, Scott? And so I'm trying to not write a book that is a compendium of other books. I'm trying to write a book that is a spotlight on other people's content so that you learn about people perhaps you didn't know about, and you go buy their book and make them part of your circle, your board of directors, so to speak. That's the purpose of the Master Mentor series.
Yeah, I love that. Not having an original thought. Very few of us do, and I would argue probably none of us. And Napoleon Hill, when he wrote The Law of Success, he says that right in the beginning of the book in terms of what you're going to read here. There's nothing novel in terms of what I've come up with. What I have done is combined different messages in a different form that hopefully resonates with you as a reader.
Wait, are you saying that I'm the next Napoleon Hill? That's kind of what I'm hearing.
You're there,
Patrick.
I mean, clearly this happened.
From your lips to my publisher's contracts.
I love it. So listen, you have 30 in here. We're not going to get to all of them, but as I was reading this, and especially in the environment today, there were a couple of themes that I picked out that I'd love to throw around. One was around listening. And I think in the environment we're in right now, our inability to listen, to understand, I think has been detrimental to a lot of relationships. One of the individuals was Julian Treasure in here. What was that conversation like?
So Julian Treasure, like you, is a fairly famous TED speaker. His TED Talk has, I think, hundreds of millions of views. He's a British listening communication expert, wrote a book called How to Listen, I think it is. And the insight that Julian Treasure brings is recognizing that everyone listens differently.
Yeah.
I think we spend a lot of time in our careers understanding our leadership style, understanding our personality style. But Patrick, I don't think many of us really assess what is our communication style. And we have one. Right. I have one, you have one. And I think as we look post-pandemic, hopefully, to a world where people have choices and people don't want to work for bad cultures or bad bosses anymore, and they're willing to quit and go open up an NFT or a Etsy store or trade crypto. They're not like your and my generation where they own 3 cars. Heck, they don't even own a car. Most of them don't have a license anymore because they're of different values than we do. Good on them. We've got to make sure that we have an individualized style of leadership. So for all of you who are leaders of people or are thinking of becoming a leader of people, which by the way, not everyone should be an anesthesiologist. Not everyone should be a commercial airline pilot. Not everyone should be a leader of people. So be thoughtful around how you might be lured into leadership. But if you are going to be a leader of people formally, then you need to be very thoughtful around how do those people want to be led, and they all want to be led differently. They want to be listened to, treated, validated, praised differently, and they also have different listening styles. So Julian Treasure's insight, it's a little bit of an awkward term. He calls it listen to the listening. And that means you've got to be nimble and agile and mature enough to change your communication style to the way different people listen differently. And I have one style. It's loud, it's fast, it's charismatic, it's dominating. And this is my natural voice level all the time. And it's quite fatiguing to a lot of people. I talk this loud, whether I'm in front of 7,000 people or in the car next to my wife driving to lunch.
For those of you that can't see Scott, his hands, I can't see his face because they keep flashing in front of his face. His hands do.
But I'm a very loud,
awesome,
passionate person. And sometimes that works for me. And oftentimes it works against me. So the big idea here is just to understand, if you want to be an influential leader, you've got to be self-aware of what is your default communication style and how do you modify it and moderate it to the way other people listen, which means you have to get to know them. You have to get to know them and really understand what are their fears and their passions and their joys and what types of leadership work well for them. And leadership is more difficult now than even pre-pandemic because your style, historically, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, you had a style. Everybody cleaved to that. They had to align themselves to your style. It doesn't work that way anymore. You've got to make sure that you are listening to the way each and every person in your life needs to be communicated to, including your spouse, and your kids, and your neighbors, and your committee members, and all that.
Without question. You actually mentioned in that chapter that you talk about your own learning lesson there, going back to, this was the old Scott, where you were told by your boss, you make too many declarative statements.
Yeah, that was a lovely day. Yeah, so I was the CMO, the Chief Marketing Officer of the Franklin Covey Company for a decade, well-respected global leadership firm. And the CEO, a lovely man. We are very different in personality and competence, but I love him and he loves me, which is why I stayed 25 years because my boss loved me. People don't quit leaders who love them. People don't go across the street for 1% more commission or $2 more an hour or $10 more a year if they believe their leader loves them. You stay.
Without question. That's a podcast in and of itself.
It is in and of itself. People don't quit leaders who love them. But this particular leader, we have very different personalities, and he has what I call a telepathic leadership style. He does not like confrontation. Now, do not back him into a corner because you will lose. Do not underestimate his fierce tenacity to win. But he's a very gracious person and he likes harmony. And so one day in the C-suite, after a very long executive team meeting where I had spotted out way too many of my opinions, as the meeting came to a close, he walked past me and looked me in the eye. And he said to me, like you said, Scott, you make too many declarative statements. And he went to the restroom. Now, this is the CEO of a global public company, suit, tie, your iconic public CEO, impeccable character. Wow. Talk about an ego enema. And he was right. So what I did was I just started forming my statements into the sound of questions. I would say, are we concerned about the fact that this and this is happening? So I'm not sure I learned a whole lot on that other than how to frame declarative statements into interrogative
Do they call that passive aggressive at all? I don't.
Him or me? Yes. I'm not passive aggressive. I'm flat out aggressive. But anyway, I love that man. It was actually a very insightful comment to me. And because he was such like an E.F. Hutton type, for your younger listeners, Google that.
I was going to say.
I knew exactly what he meant. And I didn't need to go through the pain of having him describe it to me. So I did some stealth exploration on talking less, being the genius less in the room, and doing a better job of listening. And in some cases, when I just chemically could not keep my mouth shut, I formed my statement in the phrase of a question. So I sounded less arrogant.
I thought you were going to say you left the room. You just left.
No, that would have been a more mature version of Scott Miller.
To dovetail off of that, another theme through there is around self-awareness. And I think the two go together. And you talk about Tasha Eurich.
Yeah.
And I loved the definition that she used, and I'm going to look at it right now. She said, having the will and the skill to see yourself clearly. And I think that's so important where it talks about the will, right? Because people have to want to do this first to be awareness. And also then how do you develop the skill to really know yourself more clearly?
This is a phenomenal mentor, Tasha Eurich. She's an organizational psychologist out of Denver. She wrote a very famous book called Insight, INSIGHT. And she looks at self-awareness from how we see ourselves and also how others see us internally and externally. Highly recommend the book Insight. And I'll tell you, Patrick, I don't know about you, but I spent my career, nearly 30 years, in formal leadership positions at Disney, the Walt Disney Company, and at the Franklin Covey Company. And I had the honor of interviewing thousands of people over the course of my career and hiring hundreds and terminating dozens of them. And I can tell you in 28 years, more than that, I never once had to fire someone because they lacked the technical skills to do the job they were hired for. They always had the technical skills. Every single termination that I was responsible for executing on, every one of them was because the person had no idea what it was like to work with them. They had no idea what it was like to lead them or be led by them or stand in a trade show booth for 3 days with them or be in a Zoom call or launch a product with them. They had no idea. And oftentimes it was because I don't think they ever had a leader who loved them enough to risk not being liked in the moment to tell them the truth, to give them feedback on their blind spots. I mean, I'll tell you, again, I'm on a little bit of a tangent here, but 30 years in the leadership business, I do not believe that a leader's number one job is mission, vision, and values or systems, structures, and strategies. You've got to do those things. I believe a leader's number one job is to recruit and retain talent. Recruit and retain talent. Talent that is noticeably and palpably more talented than you are. And the second most important role of a leader is to give people feedback on their blind spots, which requires you to move outside your comfort zone, discuss the undiscussables, sit someone down, declare your intent. My intent is not to minimize you or embarrass you. My intent is to help you build a more expansive brand here. And I want to give you some feedback on some things I see you doing that are limiting your reputation here. This is a leader who loves her people because people aren't naturally self-aware. I wasn't naturally aware that my voice is always at this level until my wife says to me, "You are a jackass. Why are you talking so loud? I don't like you. Stop screaming in my ear." And my sense is it probably comes, Patrick, from me feeling a need to have power over people. The louder I speak, the more firm I am, the more they'll do what I want. And of course, that's a diminishing thing. I don't know how people see me. I'm trying to learn that so I can have better friendships and a stronger marriage. But this is a chapter I'm especially passionate about.
Yeah. As you were talking about that too, I think to work that I do with teams around the three things that I would say over the years I have found if you think about it like a Venn diagram, I think the best teams do three things. One is they support each other. We have each other's backs. And I think that comes in the forms of listening and appreciation or empathy for those around us. The next is they celebrate each other. And again, I think that's about recognizing people for who they are and for what they do. So those two things I think are really important. And I don't think we do enough of that, the celebration part within organizations, that we recognize people, because this old mentality that you and I probably grew up with in terms of work was, why are we going to recognize somebody for what we pay them to do? That's what they get a salary for. The last part I think is critical, though, is that the best teams challenge each other, which is what you're talking about. But to challenge somebody in a way that is effective, you have to earn the right to be able to do that so it doesn't land in the wrong way. And the only way you do that is when you demonstrate to somebody, I have your back, I support you, and I celebrate who you are, I recognize you. And when I do those two things, I've not only earned the trust, I have an obligation to challenge you.
Patrick, that is so well said. One of the mentors from Volume 1 is Stephen M.R. Covey, Dr. Covey's eldest son. Very dear friend of mine, wrote a book called The Speed of Trust, the seminal thought leader in the world on building a high trust culture. And he says something so profound in his speeches. He says, raise your hand if you're trustworthy. Of course, everyone's hands goes up. And he says, no, put them down. Who decides if you're trustworthy? Everyone says, oh, it's the other person. And the key premise of this, and he's featured in Volume 1, is you have to behave yourself into a reputation of being trusted by others. And when someone trusts you based on the fact that you make and keep commitments, you honor confidential information, you don't gossip about people, then they're going to be more open to you giving them feedback on their blind spots because they also know your intent. They trust that your intent. And sometimes it requires you to declare your intent, like literally use the words, Patrick, I'd like to have a bit of a high courage conversation with you. Could I first declare my intent? My intent is not to do anything other than help you. My intent is not to do this. And then people, their reptilian brain calms a little bit. And if they trust you based on their experience with you, and now you have declared your intent, they're more likely to receive your feedback on their blind spots. And as a result, their self-awareness grows.
Without question. And I had the good fortune probably a couple months ago of interviewing Stephen on his book.
Wait, I'm on the same podcast as Stephen M.R. Covey?
It's like the Franklin family right here.
That's awesome.
But it's funny you say that because there was one thing that really stuck out to me, and it was around trust with him too. And to gain trust, you have to give trust. You have to say, I trust that you can handle this. You're going to do this. There's a lot of power to that in terms of when people feel as though you believe in them, you trust that they're going to be able to pull this off. It's almost like you don't want to disappoint them.
It's an epiphany for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think we all view ourselves as being trustworthy, but you've got to behave yourself into being trusted by others. That's a process, not an event. It's not a mindset. It's a reputation of making and keeping commitments.
That gets built over time. It's not instantaneous. So the last one I wanted to touch on is around, again, I think in this environment is around anxiety. And you have a great story in there about Chester Elton.
Yeah. So Chester Elton, one of the finest, most abundant people I know. He wrote a series of books. He actually got his fame came from writing The Carrot Principle back in his days in O.C. Tanner.
I saw that. Yeah,
and
his
he
orange
and his writing
outfits.
partner. That's right. And he went on, left O.C. Tanner and went on with his writing partner, Adrian Gostick, to write 4 or 5 best-selling books. He calls himself the apostle of appreciation. I'd love to keynote your conference, people, but don't hire me. Hire Chester Elton. He's actually better and riotously entertaining. He wrote a book about a year ago called Anxiety at Work. And it was, in essence, a leader's guide to understand the pervasive aspect of anxiety and how it's not going away. And if you remember the chapter in my book, Patrick, I'm fortunate I don't suffer, that I'm aware of any serious mental illness. I've had a very remarkably trauma-free life. I've been blessed with great mentors and parents and making good decisions, made some bad decisions along the way, but I've had a fairly trauma-free life. And like I said, I don't suffer from anxiety. I suffer from lots of other things, but not anxiety. And so what I did was I actually turned the chapter over to a young man who works for me. His name is Drew Young. He's 25 years old, and he suffers from crippling anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, things that I can't even comprehend. And so I highlight Chester as not the expert, but the mentor on how pervasive anxiety is in the workplace. And I turn the chapter over to Drew, and Drew writes a very vulnerable first piece to people suffering from anxiety in work. And then he follows it up and writes a chapter to their leaders, the Scott Millers of the world, and how to lead them better. It wasn't a risk because I trusted Drew a lot, but I wanted it to be a validation to both leaders like me that can't understand and get frustrated perhaps with people that have pressing emotional issues, and how to value them and make them feel seen and heard and give them some space. And also people that are suffering from anxiety, that Drew speaks to them to say, hey, it's okay. Take it one day at a time. It will get better. Reach out for help. Talk to your leader. Tell them what you're going through. And I hope that chapter is well received.
It was powerful the way it was written. And again, talking about it from the perspective of a person that's going through it, but also as a leader, here's what you need to know about. And to take a step back there, I think in regards to leadership, right? You talked about all these things that are important. I think in the programs that I went through and sort of the experience that I had, I think we spend too much time as leaders talking about leading as opposed to focusing on followers. Because without followers, we're not leading anybody. And I look at it like if I was selling a product, we would do market research and say, this is what the customers wants to buy. This is what's important to them. And if I'm selling that product and I say, yeah, that might be what they want, but I like these things and I'm going to sell a product as this, it wouldn't sell. And I think leadership development oftentimes looks that way. We haven't really looked at the market research that's been done on the customer who is the follower to say, give them what they need and they will buy your leadership. They will buy it. And the data is out there. Gallup studies, Press Ganey, whatever it is, the data is there to be able to say, that's your market research. Follow that, people will follow.
I have nothing to add to that. That was perfectly stated.
Hands are by his side, if you can't see right now. Of all of these second volume, is there one that was most important for you?
Thank you for asking. The first chapter is about a man named Zafar Masood, who survived a commercial airline crash. But the one I want to talk about is chapter number 2, Bobby Herrera. Bobby Herrera is a Latino. His family was from Mexico. They actually met a New Mexican farmer, and the farmer invited them over to work on their farm. And they showed up with 13 children, and the farmer had no idea. Bobby was the first in the family to actually be born in America. One of 13 kids from a hardworking and fairly unresource-rich family. You can imagine a Latino family with 13 children. Then went on to become a very famous entrepreneur and author. Wrote a book called The Gift of Struggle. Don't buy Master Mentors. Buy The Gift of Struggle. This is a beautiful book. You can read it in an hour. But basically, Bobby tells a story that is life-changing. When he was in high school, he and his brother played basketball on a local high school basketball team. And after every game, when the bus would stop at a restaurant, all of the members of the basketball team got off and went in to have dinner. Every game, they all got off, went in and had dinner, win or lose, except for the Herrera brothers.
Yeah.
They stayed on the bus and they ate the brown bagged dinner their mom had packed for them. How embarrassing. How emasculating.
Yeah.
every night the Herrera brothers stayed on the bus while all their teammates went and had dinner. My sense is it wasn't Ruth's Chris. It was more like the Sizzler or a burger shop. Until one day, one of the fathers of one of the teammates reboarded the bus, walked back to their seat and said in private, "Gentlemen, I want you to join the team. Be my guest." Handed them each $5 or $10, whatever it was, and says, "No one needs to know. I want you to join the team. All I ask for in return is go make something of your lives and do the same for somebody else." Now it was $10. But Bobby Herrera said it was the first time in his life he'd ever felt seen by anyone. He couldn't see tomorrow. He couldn't see next month. He couldn't see a career, couldn't see his way out of this Latino farm family, went on to run a $500 million company, write a best-selling book. And the point is, every one of us in our lives, someone reboarded the bus for us. Someone made us feel heard or feel seen. And I think that's a gift we're going to give all of your listeners today, is to think about who's the person that made you feel seen? Who boarded the bus for you? Have you told them? Because that father, his name was Mr. Teague. When Bobby launched his book, 30 years later, he found the man still alive, flew him out to his book launch and told the story. And the man wept and said, "I remember that. I had no idea the impact that had on you. You've made my life feel as if it had meaning." And I'm getting emotional telling the story because I was not raised in a family like that. I was raised in a family of more privilege. But I want to make sure that I use my time and my wealth and my positional power, my influence to make as many people feel seen as possible and to reboard the bus for people, because people reboarded the bus for me. That's Master Mentor number 32, Bobby Herrera. Go buy the book, The Gift of Struggle.
I have nothing else to say.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for a great conversation today.
This really has been phenomenal. Your book has really inspired me in so many different ways in terms of the little snippets here and there of really reflecting on how I can continue to make a difference too. What am I giving back? So for that, I thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you, sir. You're a class act.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my podcast. If you found the guests and topics on my show and my perspectives on the show to be valuable to your own personal growth or to the growth of your team, I would love the opportunity to have a discussion with you on how the models, the approaches, and the book that I've published, The Leadership Bridge, How to Engage Your Employees and Drive Organizational Excellence, can help you and your organization as well. If you're interested, you can reach out to me at patrick@emeryleadershipgroup.com, and that's EMERY, leadershipgroup.com. And let's explore how my unique models and approaches can help you and your team or your organization to rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.